She arrived with nothing but a cracked travel bag and the kind of face that made strangers look away. And the entire town of Drywater Ridge laughed at her the moment she hit the dirt. They called her ragged. They called her worthless. One woman said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that she'd be gone by morning. But Lenora Hartwell didn't leave. She stayed. And one by one, she made every single person in that valley eat their words. This is the story of a woman who walked into a dying town with nothing left to lose and ended up saving everything. Like this video, drop your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. The summer of 1874 came down on Drywater Ridge like a punishment. The sky had been white for 3 weeks straight. Not the clean white of clouds, but the bleached, hollow white of something that had given up. The creek that cut through the eastern edge of town had dropped so low that the rocks beneath it were starting to show, pale and dry as old bones. The cottonwood trees along the main road had stopped rustling. Even they seemed to be conserving what little they had left. Lenora Hartwell stepped off the stage at 2:30 in the afternoon, and the first thing she noticed was that the town smelled like dust and old wood and animals that hadn't had enough water in too long. The second thing she noticed was that everyone on the main street had stopped to look at her. She was 23 years old, and she knew exactly what they were seeing. The dress she wore had been blue once, a long time ago. It had faded to something closer to the color of a bruise, and the hem had been repaired in 3 places with thread that didn't quite match. Her travel bag, a worn leather thing with a strap she'd replaced herself using a strip of saddle leather, hung from her left hand. Her boots were good, at least. That was something. She'd kept her boots in decent shape because boots mattered. Everything else she'd let go. Her hair was dark and pinned back without much care, a few strands loose across her neck in the heat. She wasn't pretty in the way that stopped a room, but she had the kind of face that, if you looked at it long enough, became interesting. Sharp jaw. Eyes that were too direct. A mouth that didn't soften much even when she was trying to be polite. She stood beside the stagecoach and looked down the length of the main road. A single strip of packed dirt flanked by storefronts, a saloon, a feed store, a small bank with white paint peeling in long strips from its facade. And she thought, this is smaller than I was told. She'd been told Drywater Ridge was growing. That was what the letter had said. The letter she'd carried from the employment agency in Waco, the one that had promised her a position as a bookkeeper for a merchant by the name of Aldous Webb. Webb's General Goods, the letter said. Fair wages. Clean lodging. A fresh start. She looked at the storefronts. She didn't see anything that said Webb's. You looking for something? The voice came from a woman standing under the overhang of the dry goods store. She was in her mid-40s, solid built, with a sun-browned face and her arms crossed over her chest in a way that wasn't welcoming. She was looking at Lenora the way people look at stray dogs. Not with cruelty exactly, but with the particular wariness of someone who has had to deal with too many strays and doesn't want another one. Webb's General Goods, Lenora said. Do you know where it is? The woman's expression shifted, just slightly. Something moved behind her eyes. Not quite pity, not quite satisfaction, something between the two. Webb's closed, she said. 6 weeks ago. Aldous Webb packed up and moved to El Paso. You didn't get word? Evidently not, Lenora said. She kept her voice level. She'd had practice at this, at receiving bad news in front of strangers without giving them the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. She'd had a great deal of practice, so there's no position. It wasn't really a question. Honey, the woman said, and the word came out with just the faintest edge of condescension. There's barely a town. That drew a small laugh from a couple of men nearby who'd been watching the exchange while pretending to inspect the hitching post. Lenora looked at them. They looked away. She turned back to the street and assessed her situation with the same methodical calm she'd learned to apply to everything. She had $4.60. She had a change of clothes in the bag and a set of ledger books she'd bought secondhand in Waco to study accounting principles on the road. She had no contacts here, no family anywhere, no one expecting her anywhere on the continent. The last person who'd been expecting anything from her had been her mother, and her mother had been dead for 14 months. What she needed was work. Any work. Today. She picked up her bag and started walking. She asked at the bank first because that was the logical place for someone with accounting experience, however informal, to inquire. The man behind the counter was young and looked nervous in a way that suggested he was always nervous. and he told her without meeting her eyes that they weren't hiring, had no plans to hire, and that she might try the saloon. He said the last part while looking at her dress in a way she'd also had practice interpreting. She didn't go to the saloon. She tried the feed store, which was run by a squat, brick-colored man named Hennessy, who told her he had 3 sons and didn't need any help. She tried the small hotel on the north end of the road, where the woman at the desk, the same woman she'd seen earlier, she realized, who had apparently moved, looked her up and down and said they had no openings. She tried a tanner's workshop on the edge of town where a sign in the window said, "Help Wanted," and the tanner, an older man with leather-stained hands, looked at her and asked if she had experience with hides. "Not with hides specifically," Lenora said, "but I learn quickly." "Come back when you've got specific experience," he said. She came out of the tanner's into the full weight of the afternoon sun and stood on the edge of the main road and felt, for the first time since leaving Waco, the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical tiredness, but from the wearing down of will. It was different from the tiredness of the body. It was heavier. It settled in the chest. She had walked most of the town. The heat was extraordinary. She hadn't eaten since a piece of hard bread on the stage that morning, and the water she'd had from her canteen was long gone. She stood in the middle of the road and tried to think clearly, and found that thinking clearly was becoming difficult. She took 3 steps toward the center of town, and her knees simply stopped cooperating. It wasn't dramatic. She didn't cry out. There was no moment of decision. Her legs went soft, and she sat down on the dirt of the road. And then she was kneeling, and then her palms were on the ground, and then she was conscious of the dirt under her hands and the heat of the sun on the back of her neck and the sound of boots approaching. "She all right?" "Doesn't look it." "Somebody get her out of the road before she gets trampled." This last voice was a woman's, and it contained approximately the same warmth as the hotel desk clerk had offered earlier. Lenora pushed one hand against the ground and tried to get upright and made it about halfway before the world tilted sideways on her. "Hey!" A different voice now, lower, closer. She felt a hand close around her upper arm, not rough, but firm, and the support of it was what allowed her to get her feet back under her. She straightened and found herself looking at a man who was crouching beside her, his hat pushed back, studying her face with the focused, unemotional attention of someone assessing whether a situation required alarm. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe a few years older, broad through the shoulders, the kind of build that came from actual work rather than intention. His face was weathered in the specific way of men who spent most of their time outside, not damaged by it, but settled into it, the lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting more than from age. He was not clean. There was dust on his shirt and something dark on his left sleeve that might have been engine grease or might have been worse. His expression was neither kind nor unkind. It was simply present. "When did you last eat?" he asked. It was such a practical question. She'd expected something else, a comment, a judgment, the kind of semi-charitable concern that was really just social performance. Instead, he asked the most relevant question. "This morning," she said. "Early." "And water?" "A while ago." He stood, keeping his hand on her arm until it was clear she had her balance, and then he let go. He looked at her bag on the ground and then at her, and then at the small audience of townspeople who had gathered with the unhurried interest of people for whom entertainment was scarce. "You need somewhere to sit down and something to eat," he said. "I've got both, if you want them." A woman nearby, stout, middle-aged, wearing a bonnet that had seen better decades, made a sound in the back of her throat. "Gideon Cross," she said. "You don't know a thing about this woman." "I know she's about to fall over in the street, Clara," the man said without turning around. "That's enough for now." Clara opened her mouth and closed it again. Lenora looked at the man, at Gideon Cross, apparently, and made the kind of rapid, instinctive calculation that women alone in unfamiliar places learn to make very quickly. She looked at the way he held himself, the way he'd touched her arm only as long as was necessary, the practical bluntness of his questions. She looked at the people watching him, and at the fact that even the woman named Clara, who clearly had opinions, had subsided. "All right," Lenora said. Cross Ranch sat about 2 miles outside of town on a rise of land that looked west over the valley. It was not a beautiful property in any decorative sense, but it had the particular functional dignity of a place that had been built with intention and then maintained with stubbornness. The main house was 2 stories, unpainted wood gone silver gray with weather. The barn was larger than the house and in marginally better repair. There were 3 outbuildings, a bunkhouse, a water tank that was visibly lower than it should have been, and a series of paddocks where cattle moved in the slow, defeated way of animals enduring too much heat. Gideon Cross drove her out in a wagon that had a broken spoke on the left rear wheel that had been repaired with what appeared to be a piece of iron pipe and considerable ingenuity. He didn't talk much on the ride. He pointed out the ranch when it came into view and said, "That's it," and didn't offer further description, which she appreciated. There was a woman at the ranch house when they arrived, older, maybe 60, with white hair pulled back severely and the kind of face that suggested she'd been suspicious of the world for so long it had become her natural expression. She came out onto the porch before the wagon had fully stopped and looked at Lenora the way a person looks at an unexpected delivery. "Who's this?" she said to Gideon. "Woman from town. Needs food and rest. Does she have a name?" "Lenora Hartwell," Lenora said, before Gideon could answer for her. "I'm sorry to impose. I came for a position that no longer exists, and I—" She paused. There was no graceful way to finish the sentence. "I had a difficult afternoon." The older woman studied her for a long moment. "I'm May Dunn," she said finally. "I run the kitchen here. Come inside before you fall down again. You look like something the heat dragged in." It was not warm. It was not unkind either. It was simply what it was, and Lenora found she could work with that. May fed her, salt pork and cornbread and a glass of water that Lenora drank so fast May refilled it without comment and then refilled it again. Lenora sat at the kitchen table and ate with the focused, quiet intensity of someone who has been pretending not to be hungry for too long. And May moved around the kitchen doing other things and didn't watch her do it, which was a small mercy. When she was done, Lenora sat back and looked around the kitchen. It was a big room, well built, with a cast iron range that was the most expensive thing in it. But there were signs everywhere of strain. The flour barrel in the corner was not quite a quarter full. The shelves held fewer provisions than they should have for a working ranch. The account ledger on the end of the table, she could see it from where she sat, open, with entries made in a hand that was precise but clearly not comfortable with the work. Had numbers in it that she could tell, even upside down and at a distance, were not going the right direction. "Mr. Cross," Lenora said later when Gideon came into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot on the range and leaned against the counter. "I want to be clear about something." He looked at her. "I don't accept charity," she said. "I'm grateful for the food and for being taken out of the street. But I need work, not charity. If there's nothing here I can do to earn what I've been given today, I'll go back to town in the morning and find something." He drank his coffee. He didn't seem offended by this. He didn't seem surprised either. "What kind of work?" he said. "I have experience with accounts and bookkeeping. I can manage a kitchen. I can do most things that need doing around a working property if you show me what you need." "You don't look like you've worked a ranch." "I haven't. I've worked everywhere else." She paused. "I worked for 3 years keeping accounts for a lumber merchant in Fort Worth. Before that, I was in a household in San Antonio, managing the household accounts, the staffing, the provisioning. Before that, I was 17 and helping my mother keep a boarding house, which means I can cook for 20 men on short notice, and I know what a working inventory looks like and what it looks like when someone's been skimming from it." She said this last part without thinking, and then she thought about it, and then she thought about the ledger on the table. Gideon had gone still. "I'm not suggesting anyone here is skimming anything," she said. "I'm saying I know what the difference looks like." He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, and May had gone outside, and there was nothing but the sound of the range settling and the distant lowing of cattle through the window. "I've got to cook," he said finally. "May does the cooking, she doesn't do the accounts, and from what I can see, nobody's doing them very well." She held his gaze. "I'm not trying to be offensive, I'm trying to be useful." Another silence. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the measuring way he'd looked at her in the street, without the social lubrication that most people use to soften the act of assessment. "Room and board and $3 a week," he said. "Kitchen work with May, mornings. Accounts, afternoons. If May doesn't need you. Trial period, 2 weeks. After that, we see." $4, Lenora said. He raised an eyebrow. If my accounting finds you problems you didn't know you had, she said, you'll want to have paid me fairly for it. Something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth and was gone. $4, he said. Trial period stands. Agreed. Bus sirve samaskase. The bunkhouse had a small room at the near end that had been used for storage, May told her, and before that for a ranch hand's family that had moved on 2 years ago. It had a cot, a chest of drawers, and a window that faced east and caught the morning light. May helped her clear out the stacked crates of old hardware and rope and a broken saddle that had been left there apparently on the theory that it might become useful, and then they pushed the cot against the wall under the window, and May found her a clean blanket, and that was that. Don't take it personally, May said, standing in the doorway. The way people were in town. Lenora was unpacking her bag. She didn't look up. I've been not taking things personally for a long time. Drywater Ridge has had a hard year, May said. They turn mean when they're scared, like dogs. Most people do. May was quiet for a moment. Where are you from, originally? I'm from everywhere, Lenora said, and nowhere in particular. May seemed to understand that this meant she wasn't going to get more, and she said good night, and she left. Lenora sat on the edge of the cot in the small room and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. The cattle, the horses in the barn, the distant sound of men's voices from the bunkhouse proper. The heat was still present, but had softened toward bearable. Through the window, the sky was doing something extraordinary. The white had finally broken, and there was color, the first real color she'd seen all day, streaks of orange and copper burning along the horizon. She was 23 years old, and she had 70 cents left in the world, and she was sleeping in a storage room on a ranch she'd never heard of 2 days ago, in a town where the first thing every person had done was find her lacking in some way. It was fine. She'd been in worse situations. She thought about the ledger on the kitchen table and the flour barrel that was a quarter full and the water tank that was dropping, and she thought, I can be useful here. That was what she had. That was what she'd always had. Not luck. Not connections. Not the kind of soft start some women got. Just the ability to walk into a situation, understand it, and make herself necessary. She lay back on the cot and let the last of the day's heat press down on her and closed her eyes. She started in the kitchen the next morning before dawn. May arrived to find the fire already built in the range, water heated, and Lenora at the work table breaking eggs with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times. May looked at the eggs. She looked at the fire. She looked at Lenora. You didn't have to start the fire, she said. You do it every morning, Lenora said. Someone ought to share the work. May pulled on her apron without saying anything, but something in the set of her shoulders changed. Some defensive posture that had been there since the previous evening eased, just slightly. They worked in parallel that morning, not talking much, learning each other's rhythms. May was an excellent cook, practical, efficient, no wasted movement, and she ran the kitchen with the authority of someone who had been doing it for years. Lenora was careful to stay out of her way and learn rather than direct. That was important. She'd made the mistake once before, early in her career, of walking into a situation and immediately imposing her own approach on people who knew their work. It had not gone well. You had to learn the place before you could improve it. By the time the ranch hands came in for breakfast, 6 of them, ranging from a boy of about 15 to an older man with a limp, who May called Harrison, Lenora had a sense of the kitchen's rhythms. She knew where the plates were, how May liked the food laid out, what the men preferred. She poured coffee without being asked and kept it filled and stayed out of the way, except when she was needed. The hands were quiet around her in the way men are quiet around new things. There was a moment, she caught it, when the young one, maybe 18, said something under his breath to the boy beside him, and they both glanced at her. She looked at them directly, and they looked at their plates. After breakfast, when the hands had gone and May was cleaning up, Lenora went to the kitchen table and sat down with the ledger. It was worse than she'd thought. Not disastrously wrong, not obviously criminal or carelessly maintained. Gideon Cross kept his own accounts. She could see that from the handwriting, and he was not an unintelligent man. But he was keeping them the way a man keeps accounts who learned to do it from watching someone else do it without having been taught the underlying logic. Entries were in the right general places, but inconsistently categorized. Feed costs were sometimes under livestock and sometimes under general expenses, depending, it seemed, on what page happened to be open. There was no coherent inventory system. There were 3 separate entries over 6 months that said simply water with amounts beside them that could have been anything: fees to someone, equipment costs, bribes, gifts. She had no idea. She spent 2 hours with it before she heard Gideon's boots on the kitchen floor. She didn't look up. "Your water entries don't have enough detail," she said. "What are these 3 payments to? A person? A company? The town water authority?" He poured coffee and came around to look over her shoulder at the ledger, which she found somewhat more comfortable than she'd expected. He stood back far enough to give her space. "Water rights assessments," he said. "Town levies a fee each year for water access from the main channel." "Who receives the payments?" "Blackthorn Land and Water Company," he said. "Victor Blackthorn owns the assessment authority. Has for about 8 years. She wrote this down. "And the rates have been going up." "Every year." "By how much?" He was quiet for a moment. She looked up. He was looking at the ledger with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the flat, practical attention she'd seen on his face generally, but something heavier. "About 30% in 3 years," he said. "Maybe more." Lenora looked at the entries. She did the math in her head quickly, and then she wrote it out because she believed in writing things out so they were visible and real. "That's not an assessment increase," she said. "That's rent extraction." Gideon looked at the numbers she'd written. He said nothing. "It's not illegal by itself," she said. "Not if there's a proper authority structure granting the assessment power. But it's—" She paused. "It's unusual. I'd want to understand the basis of the authority." "Blackthorn has a lot of basis for a lot of things," Gideon said, with a flatness in his voice that told her this was not new territory. "In Drywater Ridge, Victor Blackthorn is the basis for most things." She filed this away. By the end of her first week, she had reorganized the ledger into a system Gideon could follow and she could work in. She'd cataloged the ranch's full inventory: provisions, equipment, livestock, land, and prepared a document showing current state against likely requirements through the end of the year if the drought continued at its current rate. The numbers were not comfortable reading. She brought it to Gideon on Friday evening, at the end of the day, when the ranch was quieting down and the light had gone golden and low. He was at the fence of the near paddock, watching the cattle, doing the slow, ongoing calculation that ranchers do about their herd. "You want to hear this now or tomorrow morning?" she said. "Now," he said, without turning. She went through it systematically. Feed reserves adequate for 90 days if he started rationing immediately. Water access adequate only if rainfall materialized within 60 days. Cash reserves, she had worked this out carefully, twice, adequate to service the Blackthorn assessment payment due in 45 days and to cover wages, but not both, if any significant unexpected expense arose. Gideon listened without interrupting. He kept his eyes on the cattle. When she finished, he said, "I knew most of that." "I know," she said, "but now it's in one place with the numbers attached, and you can make decisions from it instead of from feelings about it." He looked at her then, that direct measuring look. "That's blunt," he said. "You hired me to be useful," she said. "Not decorative." He almost smiled. She was starting to recognize the shape of it, the way it gathered at the corners of his mouth and almost arrived and then didn't quite. It wasn't coldness. It was just a man who had gotten out of the habit of smiling about things that weren't actually funny. "What do you recommend?" he said. She had prepared for this question. "Reduce the herd by 20% now, before the weight loss makes it worse. Take the cash from the sale and put it into water. Not the Blackthorn assessment, which you should pay to avoid the legal consequences, but additional water storage. Barrels, tanks, whatever you can source. Cut the feed order by 15% and start mixing in the dried scrub from the east pasture, which I know is less efficient, but it's free." She paused. "And I'd like to look more carefully at the water assessment structure." "Why?" "Because the payment increases don't match any standard assessment rationale I know of, and because something in the entries from 2 years ago—" She stopped. She wasn't ready to say this part yet. She needed to look more carefully. "I just want to understand it better." Gideon held her gaze for a moment. "All right," he said. She nodded and turned to go back to the house. She'd made it about 10 steps when he said, behind her, "Lenora." She stopped. "I heard what Clara Bates said to you in town," he said, "about being gone by morning." She turned halfway. "I've heard worse." "I know you have." He paused. "That's not what I was going to say. I was going to say—" He stopped and seemed to be considering whether what he'd been going to say was worth saying. "You've been here a week. You've done more with those numbers in a week than I've managed in 3 years. I'm not the kind of man who doesn't notice that." It was not effusive. It was not warm in the way that wanted something from her. It was said in the same tone he used to say other practical true things. "Thank you," she said. She went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and a cup of cold coffee and the specific quiet of the ranch at evening, and something in her chest, something that had been held tight for a very long time, loosened very slightly without quite letting go. Outside, the cattle moved in the near pasture. The water tank stood at its low mark against the darkening sky. Somewhere to the west, Victor Blackthorne was sitting in whatever kind of house a man like that sat in, counting a different set of numbers. She picked up her pen. There was still a great deal of work to do. In the days that followed, she settled into the rhythm of the ranch, the way water settles into new ground, finding the low places first, filling them gradually, without announcement. She was in the kitchen before May each morning, and she stayed at the table with the accounts each afternoon, and she learned the names of every ranch hand by the third day, and she used them, because she'd long since learned that using a person's name meant you'd bothered to learn it, and that mattered. The young hand who'd whispered about her that first morning was named Thomas. He was 17, the son of a farmer 2 valleys over who'd sent him to Cross Ranch for work experience, and he was at the age where uncertainty made him mock things he didn't understand. She didn't address this directly. She simply asked him, one afternoon, to help her count the inventory in the south storage shed, and she worked alongside him without commentary. And when he made an arithmetic error, she corrected it without making it into anything. And by the end of the afternoon, he was helping her and not looking sideways anymore. The older man, Harrison, was different. He'd been on the ranch for 11 years, and he watched her with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had seen many things come and go and was waiting to see which category she fell into. She didn't try to charm him or win him. She just did her work and let him watch. On her 9th day, Harrison came into the kitchen while she was working at the table and set a cup of coffee down next to her ledger without being asked. She looked up. He looked at her. "You're better at this than you've been letting on," he said. "I've been doing exactly what I was hired to do." "I know that," he said. "That's what I mean." He took his coffee and went back out, and that was, she understood, his version of acceptance. It was enough. The morning of her 11th day at Cross Ranch, Lenore was going through the original ranch records, the oldest files, which Gideon had given her reluctant access to after she'd asked 3 times, when she found the map. It was folded into the back of a ledger from 1851, pressed flat and almost dry as paper. It was a survey map, detailed and old, drawn in ink that had faded to brown, showing the valley in its earlier configuration. She could see the water channel clearly, the main channel that fed the whole valley, the one that the Blackthorne water assessment supposedly governed. But the channel on the 1851 map did not look like the channel she'd seen in reality, or the channel described in the current assessment documents. It was in a different place. She sat very still for a moment. Then she spread the map out fully on the table and set her coffee cup on one corner to keep it flat and leaned over it. The original channel, as the 1851 survey showed it, ran west of the Blackthorne land holdings. It fed the whole valley because it ran through the middle of it, distributed naturally. The current channel ran through the eastern edge of the valley, through land that was either owned by Blackthorne or that Blackthorne controlled via easements. Water that used to flow to everyone by nature now flowed through land controlled by one man, and you paid that man for access to it. She looked at this for a long time. Then she got up and went to find Gideon. She didn't find him in the barn, where he usually was at this hour. She found Harrison instead. "Where's Gideon?" she said. Harrison looked at her face. "What happened?" "I need to talk to him." He was in the east pasture checking fence lines. She walked out there in the heat and the heavy white light, and she found him crouching at a post that had shifted in the dry ground, and she said, without preamble, "How long ago did the water channel move?" He straightened. He looked at her. "What do you mean?" he said very carefully. "The 1851 survey shows the main channel running through the center of the valley. Now it runs through Blackthorn's eastern holdings." She paused. "That's not a natural shift. That's not erosion or flood work. That's deliberate diversion. Someone moved it. When and how, and was it legal?" Gideon was very still. The heat pressed down. The cattle in the pasture moved slowly, their hooves in the dry yellow grass. The sky above them was the same relentless white it had been for weeks. "My father used to talk about that," he said finally, "about how the water used to run different. I always thought it was old man talk, about how things were better before." "It wasn't old man talk," Lenora said. "The survey is clear. The channel was moved, and if it was moved without proper authorization, then every water assessment charge since the diversion has been based on an illegal claim of control." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. It was not the flat practical attention, and it was not the almost smile. It was something rawer than either. "Lenora," he said, "do you understand what you're saying?" "I understand what the map shows," she said, "and I understand what it means if the map is accurate. I want to find out whether it's accurate." She looked at him. "I think you do too." He stood there for a long moment, in the heat and the silence, and she could see him making the kind of calculation that went beyond numbers, weighing what he knew against what he was being asked to consider, against what it would cost to consider it. "Yes," he said, that single word, in that voice, in the particular stillness of the east pasture in the worst drought in 20 years, was the beginning of something that would change everything. She just didn't know yet how much. The map stayed on the kitchen table for 3 days. Gideon had asked her to leave it there, unfolded, where he could see it when he came in for meals. He didn't say why, and she didn't ask. She understood, in the way she'd come to understand a few things about him in less than 2 weeks, that he was the kind of man who needed to sit with information before he acted on it. He wasn't slow. He wasn't indecisive. He simply refused to move until he was certain of his footing, and she respected that more than she would have respected quickness. She continued working. That was what she did when things were uncertain. She worked. She went back through the original ranch records with the map's dimensions in her head, cross-referencing every water entry against the broader pattern of the valley's history. There were gaps, places where the records jumped years at a time, which meant either that documentation had been lost or that certain periods had been deliberately kept lean on paper. She made note of both possibilities without deciding between them yet. May watched her the way May watched most things, with attention that looked like indifference if you weren't paying attention. "You're going to wear a hole in that table," May said one morning, setting down a plate of biscuits beside the ledger. "I'm careful with the table," Lenora said, without looking up. "I meant from all the thinking you're doing at it." Lenora looked up then. May's expression was its usual impenetrable self, but there was something in it. Not warmth exactly, but the willingness to be warmer, if pressed. "The numbers don't add up," Lenora said. "I keep looking for the place where they start making sense, and I haven't found it yet." "Sometimes they don't make sense because someone made sure they wouldn't," May said. She put down her coffee and went back to the range. Lenora looked at her. "Has anyone looked at this before? The water assessment history? The original channel? Any of it?" May was quiet for a moment. She turned a piece of cornbread in the pan without answering right away, which meant she was deciding how much to say. "There was a man," May said finally, "about 4 years back, a lawyer from over in Crestfall who came through asking questions about the old water rights. He talked to some of the ranchers, had maps, asked the same kind of questions you're asking." She paused. "He left without finishing what he started. People said he got a better opportunity somewhere else." She turned from the range and looked at Lenora directly. Nobody believed that, but nobody said so out loud either. Lenora looked at the map on the table. "Nobody said so out loud," she repeated. "Drywater Ridge is a small place," May said. "Victor Blackthorn is not a small man." Quote. She met Victor Blackthorn for the first time on her 13th day at Cross Ranch, though she'd been hearing his name since the moment she'd arrived in the valley. He came to the ranch unannounced, which she understood immediately was his habit. arriving without warning because it established a kind of dominance, placed the other person on the back foot from the first moment. She'd known men like that, men who confused disruption with power. She was at the kitchen table when she heard the horses in the yard. She didn't go to the window, but she listened, and a few minutes later Gideon brought Blackthorn through the front door rather than around to the kitchen, which told her this was meant to be a formal call. She heard them in this front room. Two voices, Gideon's flat and careful, the other man's smooth and carrying. The voice of someone who had been listened to for so long they'd stopped questioning whether they deserved it. She stayed where she was. It was not her meeting, but she was not going to pretend she couldn't hear. "The assessment payment is coming due," Blackthorn was saying. "I'm extending a courtesy, Gideon, letting you know directly, so there's no confusion about the timeline." "I know the timeline," Gideon said. "I've always paid on time." "Of course you have. But the drought makes things complicated for everyone. I want to make sure my ranchers have what they need to stay current." A pause. "There's also the question of the Dawes parcel. Old man Dawes is having a difficult year. He may not be able to service his water rights fees and his land note simultaneously. If that situation develops, I'd want you to know I'll be looking for responsible parties to take on the parcel." "I don't need more land," Gideon said. "Everyone needs more land," Blackthorn said pleasantly. "It's just a matter of when they realize it." She heard the pleasantness of it and recognized it for what it was. It was the pleasantness of a man who already knew the outcome and was simply managing the pace at which other people arrived at it. She heard Gideon walk Blackthorn back to the door, heard the sound of horses leaving the yard, and then Gideon came into the kitchen. He looked at her across the room. "How much did you hear?" he said. "Most of it." He sat down at the table across from her. He looked older, briefly, in the afternoon light. Not old, but carrying something. "Dawes has 300 acres on the north end of the valley," he said. "Good land, prime water access. If Blackthorn takes it—" He stopped. "He controls even more of the channel flow," Lenora said. "Yes." She looked at the map. "How many families in the valley are in the same position as Dawes? Behind on the assessment, behind on land notes?" Gideon thought. 7 that I know of directly. Probably more I don't. And all of them paying water assessments to the Blackthorn Land and Water Company at rates that have gone up 30% in 3 years for access to a channel that may have been illegally moved to run through Blackthorn's property in the first place. She said it quietly, not for drama, just to hear it out loud, in full, so they were both looking at the same thing. If the original diversion was unauthorized, the entire assessment authority is built on a false foundation. Gideon was quiet for a long time. Outside, the afternoon was at its hottest, the air thick and still, the valley baked white and dry under the sky. "I need to know if that map is enough," he said. "One survey from 1851, is that enough to challenge something Blackthorn's family has been operating for 30 years? "Not by itself," she said. "We'd need corroborating records, other surveys, the original authorization documents, or the absence of them, evidence of what the channel cost to move and who paid for it." She paused. "It's enough to start looking. It's not enough to finish with." "Where do you look?" "County Records Office," she said. "Historical surveys would have been filed with the Territory Land Authority. If the diversion was legitimate, there'll be documentation. If it wasn't," she looked at him, "there'll be a gap." Getting to the County Records Office meant a day's ride to Harlan, the county seat, and Lenora understood without being told that she couldn't go alone. Not because of the physical distance, though the road was not easy, but because a woman arriving alone at a government records office asking questions about land and water rights belonging to the valley's most powerful man would be noted, and noted quickly, and word would travel faster than she could. She didn't ask Gideon to take her. She simply said, on the morning of the 15th day, "I need to go to the county records office in Harlan. I'd like to go this week if possible." He looked at her over the coffee cup. "I'll take you Thursday," he said. That was all. In the days before Thursday, she organized what she had. She made a clean copy of the relevant ledger entries, the water assessments, the payment timeline, the rate increases. And she wrote out, in her clearest hand, the specific questions she needed the county records to answer. She cross-referenced these against the 1851 map until she knew the map well enough to close her eyes and see it. Every line, every measurement. The precise location of the original channel, and how far it had been moved from its natural course. Thomas found her at the kitchen table on Wednesday evening when he came in for water, and he stopped and looked at the papers spread around her. "What are all those?" he said. "Work," she said. He came closer, in the tentative way of someone who wants to look at something but doesn't want to be caught looking. He was young enough that this came through clearly. She let him look. "Those are the water fees," he said after a moment. "I recognize the numbers. My dad pays those too." He paused. "He says they went up so much last year, he had to sell 2 horses. She looked at him. "Your father farms in this valley?" "East side, since before I was born." He said it with the particular combination of pride and worry that young people have about the places they come from. He says one more year like this one, and he doesn't know. She looked back at the papers. She didn't say anything reassuring because she had nothing reassuring that was also true. "Is there something wrong with the fees?" he asked. "Something that shouldn't be?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's what I'm trying to find out." He stood there a moment longer. Then he said, "Miss Hartwell." And she looked at him, and he said, "I'm sorry for what I said when you first got here. I didn't say it to you, but I said it to Danny, and you probably heard it." She had in fact heard it. She'd also known he was going to get there without her pushing him. "It's forgotten," she said. He nodded and took his water and left, and she went back to her papers and her careful, methodical preparations for Thursday. The ride to Harlan took 4 hours on roads that had turned to cracked clay in the drought, the wagon wheels finding every rut. Gideon drove and didn't talk much, and neither did she, which was the kind of silence she'd come to find easy with him. Not the tense silence of people who have nothing to say and are both aware of it, but the simpler silence of people who don't feel the need to fill space with noise. Halfway there, passing through a stretch of country where the land flattened and the horizon went wide and empty in every direction, he said without preamble, "How long were you in Fort Worth?" 3 years, she said. Bookkeeping for a lumber merchant. For a lumber merchant, and then for his brother, who had a hardware supply operation. The brother was more difficult. She paused. "I was good at the work. I kept getting recommended to other businesses because I was good at it. And every time I went somewhere new, the first month was the same, Tom. People wondering what I was doing there, whether I actually knew what I was doing, whether I'd made up my experience. And then they saw you work. And then they saw me work," she said. "But it never got easier. I'd finish at one place and move to the next and start the whole thing over again." She was quiet for a moment. "I got tired of it. I thought if I could find somewhere that needed what I know badly enough, it wouldn't matter so much what I looked like walking in the door." "Does it work that way?" She thought about Clara Bates saying, "You'll be gone by morning," and the look on the bank clerk's face when he'd mentioned the saloon, and the way the whole town had watched her fall in the street. "Not immediately," she said. He was quiet, and then, "You're still here." "I'm still here." The county records office in Harlan was a single large room on the second floor of the courthouse building, managed by a clerk named Prentice, who had the particular energy of a man who loved order and was grateful for any excuse to demonstrate it. He was small and precise, and clearly pleased when Lenora came in with a clear, specific list of what she needed, rather than a vague request he'd have to interpret. She asked for the Historical Water Authority surveys for the Drywater Ridge Valley, specifically any documentation related to channel modifications or diversions in the period 1855 to 1870. She asked for land grant records for the Blackthorne family holdings. She asked for the original authorization for the Blackthorne Land and Water Company Assessment Authority. Prentice went into the back room and came out with 3 boxes. He set them on the large table in the center of the room and retreated to his desk with the satisfied air of a man who has done his job well, and she opened the first box. Gideon stood near the window and watched her work. He didn't try to help, which she appreciated. He understood, she thought, that this was her expertise and not his, and that the most useful thing he could do was stay out of the way. It took her an hour and 40 minutes. The original authorization documents for the Blackthorne Assessment Authority were there, filed in 1862, bearing the signatures of 2 territorial officials whose names she wrote down carefully. The authorization was real. She read it 3 times. It was real and it was legal, at least on its face, but the channel modification records were not there. The authorization assumed the existing channel, described in language that precisely matched the current eastern route, through what was now Blackthorne land. But there were no prior records showing the channel in that location before 1860, and there were no permits, no hearings, no documentation of any kind authorizing a modification from an earlier course. The 1851 survey she'd found at Cross Ranch was the only survey in the record that showed the original channel, and it had not been filed here. It had not been filed anywhere official. It was simply a private survey done by a man whose name she now copied from the corner of the document, a surveyor named Aldrich Crane, that had somehow ended up in the back of a ledger at Cross Ranch. She sat back. The authorization for the Blackthorn Assessment Authority was dated 1862. The only survey showing the channel in its original position was from 1851. There was no documentation of anything that happened between those two dates. No record of a modification, no record of the channel moving, no record of any authorization for it to move, which meant one of two things. Either the documentation had never been created because the diversion had been done without proper authority, or it had been created and was no longer here. She looked at the boxes on the table. She looked at Prentice at his desk across the room, carefully writing something in a register. "Mr. Prentice," she said. He looked up. "These records, the Water Authority files from this period, are these the complete holdings? Or would there be additional documentation stored elsewhere? With the Territorial Land Office, perhaps?" Prentice's expression shifted, just slightly. The Territorial Land Office records were transferred here in 1869 when the county authority was established. Everything should be consolidated. "Should be," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "There may have been some gaps in the transfer," he said. "Records from that period were not always comprehensively maintained." She looked at him. He looked at his register. "Might some of those gaps have been assisted along?" she said. Prentice picked up his pen and looked at his register and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She told Gideon on the ride back. Not all of it at once. She laid it out methodically, in order, so he could follow the logic as she had followed it. The authorization that was real, the surveys that were missing, the gap between 1851 and 1862 that contained no documentation of how the valley's water channel had moved from the center of the land to the edge of the Blackthorn holdings. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without performing reaction, just taking it in. When she finished, the road was empty ahead of them and the sky was starting its evening change, the white finally breaking toward color. "He moved the water," Gideon said. It wasn't a question. His family did, 30, 40 years ago, likely before the county authority was established, which is why there was a window to do it without proper oversight. She looked at the road. And then when the county authority came in, the authorization documents were written to reflect the channel as it already existed, without anyone asking how it got there, or with everyone already knowing who to ask and deciding not to. "That too," she said. The wagon hit a rut, and both of them braced against it. When the road smoothed out, Gideon said, "If this comes out, if the diversion is proven illegal, what happens to the assessments, to everything Blackthorn's been charging?" "Every dollar charged since the diversion," Lenora said carefully, "was charged for access to water controlled through an unauthorized modification. Legally, the channel should revert to its original course, or at minimum to the common access of the valley. And the families who've been paying those assessments," she paused, "they've been paying for something that was never his to sell." Gideon said nothing for a while. The horses moved steady and slow through the cooling evening. "He knows you've been looking," he said finally. "He'll find out," she said. "If he doesn't know already, that's going to create problems." "I know. Not small problems." "I know that too," she said. She looked at him. "Are you telling me to stop?" He kept his eyes on the road. The last light was going out of the sky in long, slow bands, and the valley ahead of them was dark and wide and dry. "No," he said. "I'm telling you to be careful." The problems started the following week, and they started quietly, which was how the worst problems always started. First, it was the feed merchant in town who told Harrison, when he went to place the regular order, that he was temporarily out of stock on the grade of feed Cross Ranch typically used. He apologized. "Supply issues," he said. "Very sorry." He'd let them know when it came back in. Harrison came back to the ranch and relayed this to Lenora with the expression of a man who had been in this valley long enough to know what supply issues that had never happened before actually meant. "There are other merchants," Lenora said. "In Harlan," Harrison said. "That's a day's ride." "Then we go to Harlan," she said. Then it was a rumor that reached her through May. who had heard it from the woman who brought the twice-weekly milk delivery. The rumor was that Lenora Hartwell, the woman at Cross Ranch, had been asking questions at the county records office in Harlan, questions about Victor Blackthorne's land holdings and water authority, and that she was either a hired agent for some Eastern legal interest or a woman with a personal grievance against Blackthorne. The accounts differed. In either version, the implication was that she was not what she appeared to be. May told her this without inflection, standing at the range, her back to the room. "What do you think?" Lenora asked. May was quiet for a moment. "I think people in this valley have been afraid of that man for so long they've learned to do his work for him," she said, spreading the story before he even has to ask. Lenora nodded. She had expected this. It still landed heavier than she'd thought it would, not because it surprised her, but because being expected never made a thing lighter to carry. She went back to work. She had begun, in the evenings, to build the accounting case, not just the discovery of the illegal diversion, but the financial damage it had caused. If the diversion was unauthorized, then the assessment authority built on it was illegitimate, and every dollar paid to Blackthorne Land and Water Company under that authority was recoverable. She needed to demonstrate the scope. She needed numbers that couldn't be argued with. She wrote to every rancher and farmer in the valley whose name appeared in the county records as an assessment payer. She wrote careful, measured letters, explaining only that she was conducting a historical review of water access records on behalf of Cross Ranch, and asking whether they would be willing to share their own assessment payment records for the period in question. 6 of them wrote back. 3 of those sent records. She spread those records across the kitchen table alongside the Cross Ranch ledger and the 1851 survey, and worked until the lamp was low, cross-referencing, adding, building the picture one number at a time. The scale of it was larger than she'd anticipated. The water assessment alone, charged across all the valley ranches and farms over 30 years, at rates that had increased steadily, represented a sum that made her set her pen down and sit very still for a moment before she picked it up again. May came into the kitchen at nearly midnight and found her still at the table. "You should sleep," May said. "In a little while." May looked at the papers. "Is it bad?" Lenora looked at the numbers. "It's worse than bad," she said. "It's systematic. It's been going on for so long and been done so carefully that most people have stopped questioning whether it was ever legitimate." She paused. "That's the most dangerous kind of wrong, the kind that's become normal." May sat down across from her, which was unusual. May generally didn't sit at the kitchen table in the evenings. She folded her hands on top of the table and looked at Lenora with an expression that was, for the first time, fully unguarded. "Gideon's father tried," May said, "years ago, before Gideon took over the ranch. He raised questions with some of the other ranchers about the water rates. He wrote letters." She stopped. "What happened?" Lenora said. "Blackthorne called in a debt that wasn't properly documented," May said. "Old debt, from before Gideon's father had clear records. Threatened legal action. It cost the ranch 3 months of fighting it off and a substantial legal fee, and at the end of it, nothing changed." She looked at her hands. "After that, Gideon's father said it wasn't worth it. Said the ranch had to survive first and fight later." She looked up. "Later never came." Lenora held this. She thought about what May had said about the lawyer from Crestfall who'd left without finishing. She thought about gaps in county records and supply merchants who suddenly ran out of stock. "Blackthorne is very good at making the cost of looking too high," she said. "Yes," May said. "But he's done something this time that he hasn't done before," Lenora said. She looked at the 1851 survey, still unfolded, still flat under the coffee cup on the corner. "The drought. He's not the first person who's had a drought before, but this one is going to push families off their land. When people are losing land they've farmed for 20 years, the calculation changes. The cost of looking starts to seem worth it." May was quiet. "It has to be done right," Lenora continued. "It can't be accusations and anger. It has to be numbers and documents and facts so clear that there's no room to say we're wrong." She looked at the papers. "That's what I'm building." May stood up. She stood there for a moment, and then she did something Lenora hadn't expected. She put her hand on Lenora's shoulder briefly, the way someone does when words are insufficient. Then she went to bed. Lenora sat alone in the kitchen with her numbers and her maps and the low lamp and the sounds of the ranch at night, and she thought about Gideon's father, who had tried and been made to stop. She thought about the lawyer from Crestfall who'd left without finishing. She thought about Thomas's father selling horses to pay water fees for water that had been stolen before Thomas was born. She picked up her pen. Outside, the valley lay dark and dry under the stars, the water channel running its diverted course through land it had no business running through, as it had run for 30 years, as it would keep running unless someone built a case strong enough to change it. She wrote until the lamp ran out. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered not through the regular post, but by a writer Lenora didn't recognize, a young man on a gray horse who handed it to Harrison at the gate without getting down, without giving his name, and left the way he'd come at a pace that suggested he didn't want to be asked questions. Harrison brought it to the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Lenora without comment. The envelope was good quality paper, cream-colored, with her name written on the front in a hand that was practiced and deliberate. No return address. She opened it. The letter was 4 sentences long. It said that her inquiries at the Harlan Records Office had been noted. It said that the Valley's water matters were complex and best left to those with the proper authority and experience to manage them. It said that women of uncertain background and temporary employment were poorly positioned to involve themselves in matters that affected the livelihoods of an entire region. It said, in its final sentence, that she should consider carefully whether her current position at Cross Ranch offered the kind of long-term security she appeared to need. It was not signed. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket, where she kept things she needed to keep track of. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the numbers. May had been watching from the range. "What was it?" she said. "A suggestion," Lenora said, "that I mind my business." May said nothing. She turned back to the range, but the set of her shoulders said everything. Isa. She showed Gideon the letter that evening. He read it standing in the doorway of the kitchen, still in his work clothes, and his face went through several things in quick succession: recognition, anger, and then a flat, cold settling that she'd come to understand was his version of resolve. He handed it back to her. "You're not going to stop," he said. It was not a question. "No," she said. "Then we need to move faster than we have been." He came fully into the kitchen and sat down at the table. "What do you still need?" "Physical evidence of the diversion itself," she said. "The survey and the missing records tell us what happened on paper. But if we can find the actual physical works, the old channel bed, evidence of where the water was redirected, any remains of the original diversion structure, it makes the case harder to attack. It corroborates the documentary record with something that can't be altered or lost." "The original channel would have been east of the Dawes property," Gideon said slowly, thinking through the geography. "Maybe 2-3 miles into the scrubland before it picks up the natural grade again." He looked at her. "That's Blackthorn's outer range." "I know." "He'll have men out there. Probably not specifically guarding an old dry channel bed," she said. "Not yet. But if he knows what I've been looking at—" She stopped. "He may already know. The letter suggests someone in Harlan told him about my visit fairly quickly." Gideon was quiet. He laced his hands together on the table and looked at them. There was a cut across his left knuckle, new, from the fence work. She'd noticed he was careless about small injuries the way men who worked hard got careless, treating them as irrelevant until they became impossible to ignore. "We go this week," he said, "before he has time to think about what you might be looking for out there." "We should bring someone who knows how to document what we find," she said. "If there's a physical structure, remnants of a diversion dam, earthworks, anything, we need it recorded in a way that'll stand up." "Thomas's father," Gideon said, "Emmett Briggs. He did land survey work before he took over the farm. He's got instruments, and he's got more reason than most to want this to come out." Lenora thought about Thomas, sitting at the kitchen table while she worked, telling her about his father selling horses. "Yes," she said. "Ask him." Emmett Briggs was a lean, weathered man of about 50 who looked at Lenora when Gideon introduced her with the careful assessment of someone who had heard things about her and was deciding how much to weight them. He had his son's eyes, or rather Thomas had his, the same direct quality, the same habit of looking at things straight on. "Thomas says you're trying to prove the water was stolen," Emmett said. "Not hello, not preliminary. I'm trying to prove the channel was illegally diverted," Lenora said, "which is what made it possible to charge the whole valley for access to water they used to have for free." Emmett looked at Gideon, then back at her. My grandfather talked about the old channel, he said. Said it ran right through the center of the valley floor. Best water access any farmer could want. He paused. I always thought it was the kind of thing old men say, about how things were better before. Gideon said the same thing about his father, Lenora said. It wasn't nostalgia. It was accurate. Emmett was quiet for a long moment, looking out at his east pasture, which was as dry and hard as everything else in the valley. 3 of his cattle stood in the shade of a single scrubby tree, not moving. The water trough nearby was lower than it should have been. All right, he said. When do we go? They went on Thursday, before first light, which was Lenora's idea. 4 of them. Gideon, Lenora, Emmett with his surveying instruments in a canvas bag, and Harrison, who came because Gideon asked him, and because Harrison had been on this land longer than anyone and knew the terrain. They took 2 horses and left the wagon, traveling light and fast, and without announcing where they were going to anyone. The scrubland east of the Dawes property was rough country, broken rock and dry brush, and the particular emptiness of land that had been marginal to begin with, and the drought had made worse. The sun came up while they were riding and turned the landscape sharp and shadowless almost immediately. There were no people out here. There were no cattle. There were birds, briefly, in the early light, and then even they went quiet. Harrison led them. He'd been this way before, years back, when he'd helped Gideon's father run fence along the eastern boundary, and he said he remembered a place where the ground changed, a low depression that ran in an odd direction, the kind of thing you didn't notice unless you were looking. They found it after about an hour and a half of riding. It was not dramatic, it was not obvious. If you weren't looking for it, you'd ride right past it, a shallow depression in the earth, maybe 8 feet wide at its widest, running in a gentle curve from northeast to southwest, its direction subtly at odds with everything around it. The sides were eroded and overgrown with dry scrub. The bottom held nothing but cracked earth and old root systems. But the shape of it was unmistakable once you understood what you were looking at. A dry channel. Old. Very old. Lenora got down from her horse and stood at the edge of it and looked at its direction and looked at the 1851 survey, which she'd folded and carried in her jacket, and looked at its direction again. This is it, she said. Emmett was already out of his saddle with his instruments. He crouched at the edge of the depression and ran his hand along the eroded face of the bank and looked up at her. This didn't dry up on its own, he said. The cut on this edge is too clean, even with erosion. Something was done to redirect the flow. He moved along the depression about 20 yards, studying the ground. There, he pointed. They walked to where he'd pointed. The depression widened there, and in the widest part, half buried by decades of accumulated dirt and encroaching vegetation, was a structure. Not large, maybe 6 feet across. Built from stone and what had once been timber, the timber long since rotted to soft gray remnants, but the stone still in place, still in the rough shape of a low barrier. A diversion dam. Small, simple, but clearly constructed. Harrison stood beside it and took his hat off and held it in his hands and said nothing. How old? Gideon said to Emmett. Emmett crouched at the structure and examined the stonework. Hard to say exactly. The mortar, or what's left of it, is very old. 50 years at minimum, could be more. He looked up. But somebody built this. This didn't happen by erosion or weather. Somebody put these stones here to push the water east. Lenora looked at the structure for a long time. She thought about the 1851 survey, which showed the channel running free and open through the center of the valley. She thought about the 1862 authorization documents that had described the channel in its current eastern position as if it had always been there. Somewhere between those 2 dates, someone had come out to this scrubland with stone and labor and built this barrier and turned the water away from where it belonged. Document everything, she said to Emmett. Every measurement. The direction of the channel, the dimensions of the structure, the materials, everything you can record. I know how to do a site survey, Emmett said mildly, but without offense. I know you do, she said. I'm sorry. He nodded and got to work. She and Gideon stood a little apart while Emmett surveyed and Harrison walked the length of the depression, going slowly, looking at the ground with the concentrated attention of a man taking stock of something he'd suspected for years. We need to move on the records now, Lenora said quietly. This plus the 1851 survey, plus the gap in the county records. That's a foundation. It's not complete, but it's enough to take to a lawyer who knows land rights. She paused. The right kind of lawyer, not one who can be leaned on. There's a man in Crestfall, Gideon said. Name of Aldrich. Been there a long time, established practice, doesn't do business with Blackthorn interests from what I know. He paused. Couldn't afford to be bought, if it came to it. Too old and too settled. How soon can you contact him? I can ride to Crestfall early next week. She thought about the letter, about how quickly word had traveled from Harlan back to Blackthorn. Can you send a letter instead, something that doesn't put you on the road where people will notice? He looked at her. You think we're being watched? I think we should act as if we are, she said, until we know otherwise. He was quiet. Out in the depression, Emmett was moving methodically, recording measurements in the careful shorthand of a man who'd done this work before. Harrison had found a second, smaller stone structure further along the channel bed, an ancillary diversion, it looked like, and was calling Emmett over. There's more, Harrison called. They walked over and looked at the second structure. It was smaller and more deteriorated, but unmistakably constructed. Emmett knelt at it and examined the stonework and said, Same materials, same general construction. Whoever built the first one built this too. They built the whole system, Lenora said. This isn't one intervention. It's a managed diversion. They didn't just block the channel, they engineered it. She looked at the two structures, at the line of the old depression running between them. This took planning. This took resources. A family with money and the ability to put men on the land without being questioned. She looked at Gideon, 30 years before the county authority existed to ask about it. Blackthorn's grandfather, Gideon said. Almost certainly. The sun was well up now and the heat was building and the scrubland was bright and harsh in every direction. A hawk moved overhead in a slow circle, looking for something in all that dry emptiness. Emmett finished his survey in 2 hours. He had 6 pages of careful measurements and sketches, signed and dated in the precise hand of someone who understood what his signature on a document meant. He rolled them and put them in his canvas bag with the instruments and straightened up and looked at Lenora. Is this enough? He said. It's significant, she said. Combined with the documentary record, yes. She paused. But we need to get it back and secured before anyone knows we've been out here. They rode back by a different route, Harrison's suggestion, moving through the lower scrubland rather than back along the edge of the Dawes property. It took longer but kept them off the more traveled ground. By the time they reached the Cross Ranch fence line, it was past noon and the heat was at its worst, the horses sweating and slow. Gideon helped her down from her horse at the gate, and when her feet hit the ground, she realized her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear exactly, but from the specific tension of a long morning spent doing something consequential and irreversible. You all right? He said. Fine, she said. I'm fine. He looked at her hands and didn't say anything. Bomb. 3 days later, the second pressure arrived. It came in the form of a man named Caulfield, who presented himself at Cross Ranch on a Saturday afternoon with a letter of introduction from the Blackthorn Land and Water Company, in a manner that was all professional courtesy on the surface with something considerably harder underneath it. He was tall and thin, in a city suit that looked wrong in the heat, and he asked to speak with Gideon. Lenora was in the kitchen when Gideon brought him through, and she heard the beginning of the conversation before Gideon closed the front room door. What she heard was Caulfield saying, in the smooth manner of a man who had done this many times before, that he was there to discuss an offer, a generous offer, in his words, for the purchase of the Cross Ranch water rights and a renegotiation of the existing assessment structure. She put down her pen. She went to the front room door and knocked once and opened it without waiting to be invited. Both men looked at her. Caulfield's look was the kind of look that assessed a woman and then filed her away as irrelevant, all in under 2 seconds. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, in the tone that meant she wasn't. Mr. Cross, I need a word. Gideon looked at her. There was something in his eyes, not irritation, but the kind of attention that meant he was reading her as closely as she was reading the situation. Excuse me a moment, he said to Caulfield. He came into the kitchen and she closed the door partially and said quietly and quickly, He's here to get you to sign something. Whatever the offer is, the point isn't the money. The point is the document. Anything you sign renegotiating your water rights now would compromise your standing in any subsequent legal action. Don't sign anything. Gideon looked at her for about 2 seconds. Then he said, "Okay." He went back into this front room. She stood at the kitchen table and listened to the muffled conversation. Gideon's voice flat and brief, Caulfield's voice moving through several registers of persuasion, from collegial to practical to something that stopped just short of pointed. It went on for about 20 minutes. Then she heard the front door, and she heard Caulfield's horse leaving the yard. Gideon came back into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. "He offered 3 times the annual water rights value," he said. "Of course he did," she said. "He needs signatures, not fights. Fighting costs time and attention and the risk that other people start looking. Buying is cleaner." He said the offer had a deadline, end of the month. "That's because at the end of the month, you'll either have made more progress on the legal case or the drought will have pushed more people off their land and he'll have options he doesn't have now." She looked at him. "He's not offering because he's generous. He's offering because he's worried." Gideon looked at her with an expression she was starting to know, the one where he was taking in something she'd said and placing it against what he already knew and finding that the two things fit. "He's worried," he said slowly. "Someone told him what we found," she said, "or told him what we might have found. The offer came 3 days after we went to the eastern scrubland." The kitchen was very quiet. Through the window, the afternoon light fell flat and white on the dry yard. In the far paddock, the cattle stood in the heat. "Then we're out of time," Gideon said. "We've been out of time since the letter," she said. "Now he knows it too." That evening, she wrote to every rancher who had responded to her letters and to 3 more she hadn't contacted yet. She wrote quickly but carefully, saying that there had been a development in the water rights investigation and that she was requesting an urgent meeting at Cross Ranch at the earliest possible date. She did not put specifics in the letters. She was past the point of trusting that any written communication would stay between the intended parties. Thomas wrote them all out before dark. While she waited for responses, she organized everything they had into a single comprehensive document: the 1851 survey, Emmett's site survey of the old channel and diversion structures, the county records showing the gap in authorization documentation, the payment histories from the ranches that had provided them, the financial calculation of cumulative damage across the valley. She wrote it in the clear, methodical style she'd been trained to use, without drama, without excess, each fact supported by a specific document, each document referenced by its source. It was the kind of document that, if read by the right person with the proper authority, was very difficult to argue with. That was the point. Everything she'd built in her life had been built on the same principle. Not force, not volume, but clarity. The kind of clarity that left very little room for the comfortable ambiguities that powerful men relied on. May found her at the table late that night, writing the final pages of the document by lamplight. "People are going to come to that meeting," May said. She'd been in and out all evening, staying up later than usual without making much of a reason. "Not just the ranchers who wrote back, word gets around." "I know," Lenora said. "Some of them are going to be afraid," May said. "Even if they want this to come out, they're going to be afraid of what it costs them if it doesn't." "I know that too. And Blackthorn isn't going to sit still for it." May sat down. "Once you put those people in a room together, once you give them what you've found, and they all know it, there's no putting it back." She looked at Lenora steadily. "You understand that?" Lenora looked at the document in front of her. She thought about the lawyer from Crestfall who'd left without finishing. She thought about Gideon's father, who'd tried and been stopped, and who'd said later and had never found the later. She thought about Emmett Briggs selling horses, Thomas's father, the man who'd called it old man talk when it wasn't. "Yes," she said. "I understand. And you're going ahead?" "Yes." May was quiet for a moment. "Good," she said, and the word came out with a firmness that surprised Lenora. Not because May was soft, she'd never been soft, but because the word held something that had been withheld for a long time and was now being released. Lenora went back to writing. She was halfway through the final section when she heard it. Hoofbeats in the yard, coming fast, at an hour when no one should be coming fast. She was on her feet before she'd fully decided to move, and she heard Gideon's boots on the stairs above her, and they both reached the front door at nearly the same moment. Harrison was in the yard on horseback, and even in the low light she could see that something was badly wrong. He'd ridden hard. The horse was blowing, sides heaving, and his face was a particular kind of controlled that meant he was working to stay controlled. Riders on the east boundary, he said, not getting down. 4 of them. They had lanterns. They weren't ranch hands. Wrong horses, wrong gear. He paused. And they were at the fence line near the old surveying markers. Lenora felt it go cold and sharp in her chest. The surveying markers Emmett had set when he documented the channel site. They're looking for what we found, she said. Or they already found what we found and they're making sure we can't use it, Harrison said. Couldn't tell which from the distance I had. Gideon was already looking at her. In the lamplight from the open door, his face was very clear. The practical attention, and beneath it, something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The kind of feeling that comes when something you've been approaching from a distance suddenly arrives at full size in front of you. The document, he said. She understood immediately. Inside, I'll get it. She went back into the kitchen and gathered everything. Every page of the compiled document, the 1851 survey, Emmett's survey notes, and put them in the leather satchel she'd brought from Waco and never unpacked. The good one. The one with the buckle closure that didn't slip. She buckled it twice. Then she stood in the kitchen for a moment and looked at the table, at the lamp, the coffee cup, the pen still in its holder. And she thought about everything that had led from a woman falling to her knees in a dusty street to this moment, with a bag of evidence in her hands and 4 riders on the eastern boundary at midnight. She'd come here with nothing to lose. That had been true once. She was no longer certain it was true now. And the uncertainty of it, the weight of what she'd built here, what she'd found here, what she was now very clearly willing to fight for, settled on her differently than anything had settled on her in a long time. She picked up the satchel and went back out. We need to move, she said to Gideon. Tonight. We need to get this to the lawyer in Crestfall before anyone knows we have it. Gideon looked at her. He looked at the darkness of the valley around them, the dry, wide, lightless dark. And then he looked at Harrison. Ride to the Briggs farm, he said to Harrison. Tell Emmett what you told me. Tell him to secure his survey notes and meet us at the Crestfall Road junction before dawn. He paused. And wake the hands. All of them. I want eyes on every boundary tonight. Harrison turned his horse and was gone. Gideon looked at Lenora. You don't have to come, he said. I can carry the documents. They're my documents, she said. I'm coming. He nodded. No argument, no hesitation. He went to saddle the horses, and she stood in the yard with the satchel against her chest, and the valley dark and vast around her, and the first suggestion of something on the eastern horizon. Not dawn, not yet, but the absence of full dark that meant dawn was coming. The drought had gone on too long. The water had run wrong for too many years. And somewhere out in the darkness, 4 riders were trying to make sure it stayed that way. She buckled the satchel a 3rd time and waited for Gideon to bring the horses. The road to Crestfall ran through the lowest part of the valley before it climbed, and in the darkness it was barely a road at all. A suggestion of packed earth between scrub and rock, the kind of track that required the horse to do most of the thinking. Gideon rode ahead, and Lenora followed, and neither of them spoke for the first hour because there was nothing to say that the situation hadn't already said. She held the satchel across her lap with one hand and the reins with the other, and she watched the darkness around them and thought about the 4 riders Harrison had seen on the eastern boundary. She tried to construct, methodically, what Blackthorne knew and what he didn't. He knew she'd been to the county records office. He knew she'd been asking questions that pointed toward the original water diversion. He'd sent the letter, then Caulfield, and when neither had worked, he'd sent men to the eastern scrubland. The sequence told her something important. He was escalating, which meant he was worried, which meant the thing she'd found was as significant as she believed it to be. It also meant he was willing to move beyond persuasion. That last part she turned over in her mind carefully, the way you turn over a stone you're not certain you want to look under. They reached the Crestfall Road junction a little before 4 in the morning. Emmett was already there, his horse standing quiet in the dark, his canvas bag over his shoulder. He looked at Lenora when they rode up. Harrison told me, he said, about the riders. Did you secure your notes? She said. Gave them to my wife, he said. Told her to keep them under the floorboard in the root cellar until I came back. He paused. She didn't ask what they were for. She's been married to me for 23 years. She knows when something needs to be kept quiet. Lenora looked at him. In the dark, she could see the same thing in his face that she'd seen in May's when she'd said good the previous evening. something that had been held back for a long time moving to the surface. "How far to Crestfall?" she said. "Another 2 hours," Gideon said. "Maybe less if we push." They pushed. Aldrich was a lawyer who had been practicing in Crestfall for 31 years, and he looked it. He was in his late 60s, heavy through the shoulders, with white hair that needed cutting and spectacles that sat low on his nose, and a manner that managed to be both unhurried and completely alert. He received them at his office at 7 in the morning, which meant his clerk had been sent to wake him, which meant Gideon's letter from earlier in the week had prepared him for the possibility of an urgent visit. He read through Lenora's compiled document at his desk while they sat across from him, and he did not speak while he was reading. He read with the focused, expressionless attention of a man who had read a great many documents and knew how to look at them, not at what they claimed to say, but at what the evidence actually demonstrated. It took him 25 minutes. He set the last page down and took off his spectacles and looked at Lenora. "You built this," he said. It was somewhere between a question and a statement. "Yes." "The accounting analysis is yours?" "Yes." He looked at the document. "The site survey is Emmett Briggs." "It is," Emmett said. Aldrich picked his spectacles back up and looked at the survey pages again. "These measurements, you're confident in their accuracy?" "I've been doing survey work for 30 years, Emmett said. "I'm confident." Aldrich set the spectacles down again. He looked at Gideon. "The 1851 survey was found in your ranch records." "In an old ledger my father kept," Gideon said. "I never knew it was there." "And no copies exist elsewhere that you know of?" "Not that we've found," Lenora said. "The county records have nothing before 1862 that shows the channel in its original position. The 1851 survey appears to be the only surviving documentation from before the diversion." Aldrich was quiet for a long moment. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the Crestfall Main Street, which was beginning its morning business outside. People, horses, the ordinary movement of a town that didn't know anything about what was happening in this room. "The diversion itself," he said without turning from the window. "You found the physical structure." "Two structures," Emmett said. "A primary diversion dam and a secondary ancillary redirect. Both built from the same materials, same general period. Both on land that is now or was historically associated with the Blackthorn family holdings. Within half a mile of the eastern boundary of the old Blackthorn grazing range," Emmett said. "Yes." Aldrich turned from the window. "All right," he said. "I'll tell you what you have and what you don't have. What you have is a legitimate evidentiary foundation, a prior survey showing the channel's original course, physical evidence of deliberate diversion, documentary evidence of a gap in the authorization record, and a financial accounting showing damages to multiple parties over a sustained period. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, considerably more than most people bring me when they want to challenge a land and water arrangement that's been in place for 3 decades. He paused. He came back to the desk and sat down. "What you don't have is time," he said. "If Blackthorn has men out looking at that channel site, he knows you've been there. He'll be moving to consolidate his position, filing preemptive documents, calling in favors with the county authority, potentially moving against the families who are most financially vulnerable before they can join any legal action." He looked at them each in turn. "The moment you retain me and we file a formal complaint, he'll know exactly where you stand and what you have. There is no going back from that moment." Lenore looked at Gideon. He was looking at Aldrich, his face doing that thing it did when he was taking in the full weight of something, not recoiling from it, just measuring it accurately. "What's the timeline?" Gideon said. "If we file this week, we can request an emergency injunction on any further land transfers in the valley pending the water rights review. That stops him from moving against the Dawes parcel and any of the other vulnerable properties while the case proceeds." Aldrich paused. "Filing this week means the document needs supplementary testimony from the other ranchers who provided payment records. Signed, witnessed. I need at least 5. "I'll get them," Lenore said. Aldrich looked at her. "In 3 days?" "Yes," she said. He studied her for a moment. Then he said simply, "All right." 3 days was not enough time, and she did it in 3 days. She and Thomas rode together, which had been Thomas's idea. He'd appeared in the yard before she'd finished saddling her horse on the morning they returned from Crestfall, and he'd said, without preamble, I know all these farms. I can get you in the door faster than you can get yourself in. She'd looked at him and said, Mount up. They went to 7 farms and ranches in 3 days, covering ground in the brutal heat of late July. And at each one, Lenora sat at kitchen tables and parlor tables, and at one farm, at a workbench in a barn because that was where the family felt most comfortable, and she went through what she had. Not all of it. She gave each family enough to understand the scope, and enough to understand what their participation meant. Some of them she'd expected to say yes, and they did. Emmett Briggs, obviously, who was already in. The Halverson family, who ran cattle on the North Range and had been paying Blackthorn assessments for 20 years and had never stopped quietly resenting it. A widow named Doris Crane, and the name made Lenora stop when she first heard it, and then she asked, and yes, Doris was the granddaughter of Aldrich Crane, the surveyor whose name appeared in the corner of the 1851 map. That particular coincidence felt like the kind of thing that happened when you were finally finding the real shape of a story that had been there all along. Some she'd expected to hesitate, and they did. A farmer named Gruber, who had 4 children and a 5th on the way, and was behind on every obligation he had, and was terrified, visibly, of making things worse. She sat with him for an hour. She didn't push. She laid out what the filing of the injunction would mean, that Blackthorn couldn't move against his land while the case was active, that his participation strengthened the case for everyone, including himself, that the risk of action was real, but the risk of inaction, if Blackthorn continued consolidating the valley, was worse. Gruber's wife, who hadn't said anything for the first 40 minutes of the conversation, said, "Sign it, Johann." Just that. 3 words. He signed. One family, the Meachams on the southern edge, told her no. The husband was polite but firm, and she could see that the decision had been made before she arrived, that someone had already spoken to them about the cost of signing, and she didn't push them. She thanked them for their time, and she and Thomas rode on. On the road between the Meacham place and the last farm on the list, Thomas said, "Blackthorn got to them first." "Probably," she said. "Doesn't that worry you?" She thought about it honestly. "It means he knows the shape of what we're doing. It doesn't change the shape of it." She looked at the road ahead. "It just means we need to be faster than we've been." Thomas was quiet. He was a different young man than the one who'd whispered about her that first morning at the ranch. Not transformed. People didn't transform in a month, but clarified, the way a face clarifies when the expression on it becomes something it actually means. "My dad told me last night," Thomas said, "that if this works, the water coming back through the center valley, his east pasture could irrigate properly for the first time since he bought it." He paused. "He paid for that land expecting to have that water." "I know," she said. "He worked for 20 years on land that was always a little wrong," Thomas said, "because the water was wrong." She didn't have anything to add to that. It was exactly what the situation was, stated plainly, by someone who'd grown up in the middle of it. Sometimes the clearest accounting of a thing came not from the numbers, but from the person who'd been living inside the consequence. She had 6 signatures when she got back to Cross Ranch. 6 signed, witnessed affidavits from Valley families, plus Emmett's survey, plus her compiled document, plus the 1851 survey, plus the Cross Ranch records. She spread it all on the kitchen table that evening and looked at it and thought, it's enough. Gideon came in and looked at it alongside her. He looked at the signatures and something moved in his face. Not surprise, but relief maybe, that the thing they'd been building in isolation and urgency had turned out to be real when you laid it out in full. "Aldrich can file Monday," Lenora said. "I'll ride to Crestfall tomorrow to deliver everything." "I'll come with you," Gideon said. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," he said. There was something in his voice, not impatient, just definite, the way he said things when they were settled for him. She didn't argue. Bescheidet. The meeting happened the night before they rode to Crestfall, and it was not something Lenora had planned. It started as the ranchers and farmers who'd signed the affidavits gathering at Cross Ranch to be certain their documents were complete before Lenora took them to Aldrich. That was the practical reason. But word had spread, the way word always spread in a small valley, and by the time the sun was going down, there were more people in the Cross Ranch yard than Lenora had invited, families she hadn't reached in her 3-day circuit, neighbors of neighbors, people who'd heard something was happening and had made the decision to come and see for themselves. She stood in the yard and counted, and there were somewhere between 30 and 40 people. May, from the porch, looked at Lenora with an expression that said, "You started this. You'd better finish it." She hadn't prepared anything to say. She thought about that for a moment, about whether to go inside and write something out, organize her thoughts, and then she decided against it. She'd spent a month building a case from paper and numbers and surveys and old maps. She knew this material the way she knew how to breathe. She didn't need notes. She stood in the middle of the yard with the last light of evening behind her and the crowd of people, farmers, ranchers, their wives, a few older men she didn't know by name, Thomas standing near the back beside his father. And she told them what she'd found. She told it plainly, not simplified, because these were people who understood their own land and their own water and didn't need it made simple. But plainly, what the 1851 survey showed, what the county records didn't show, what Emmett had found in the eastern scrubland, what the numbers said about how much money had been extracted from the valley under false authority over 30 years. She told it without drama, and somehow the lack of drama made it more devastating than drama would have been. The yard was very quiet while she spoke. She watched people's faces. The older men who'd been here longest, whose expressions went through something complicated as the story of the valley they thought they knew became a different story. Gruber and his wife, standing close together. Emmett, who nodded slightly at the mention of the site survey, confirming it. Doris Crane, who looked at the mention of her grandfather's name with an expression she quickly controlled. When she finished, the silence held for a moment. Then a man she didn't know, one of the older ones, heavy-built, with gray in his beard, said, "How certain is the legal case?" "Certain enough for a lawyer with 30 years of experience to file it," she said. "Not certain enough to promise a specific outcome. I won't do that." "Blackthorn will fight it," another man said. "Yes," she said, "he will. He's got resources we don't have. Money, connections, people in the county authority who owe him favors." "All of that is true," she said. "And what we have is documentation he can't make disappear because it's going to Crestfall tomorrow, and once Aldrich files it, it becomes part of a formal record." She looked at the man. "He can fight the case. He can't fight what's already documented." A woman near the back, she didn't know her either, said, "What happens to the money we've already paid? The assessments all these years?" "That's part of the case," Lenora said. "If the diversion is ruled unauthorized, the assessment authority built on it is illegitimate. Recovery of past payments is a separate proceeding, but it's made possible by the primary case." She paused. "I'm not going to tell you everyone gets everything back. I don't know what a court will do. What I know is that right now, tonight, the case exists and it's strong, and tomorrow it goes to a lawyer who can use it." The older man with the gray beard said, "What do you want from us?" She looked at him. "I want you to know what's happening," she said. "And I want the people who haven't already signed to consider whether they want to add their names before the filing. More signatures make the case stronger. They also make it harder for Blackthorn to isolate and pressure any single family." She let that sit. Gideon was standing near the porch railing behind her. She hadn't asked him to speak, and he hadn't volunteered, which was correct. This was not a moment for the large landholder to lead. But his presence in the yard, his standing there with his arms at his sides and his face open and visible to everyone, said something without words that she couldn't have said. One by one, 4 more people came forward and asked to sign. She rode to Crestfall the next morning with Gideon and a satchel that was now considerably heavier, and she handed everything to Aldrich, who looked through the additional affidavits with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and said, 10 signatures. 10, she said. He looked at her over his spectacles. "I'll file Monday," he said. "The injunction request will be filed simultaneously. The county court will have to respond within 2 weeks. And if Blackthorn moves before the court responds? That's why we're filing the injunction," Aldrich said. "Any transfer or action taken after the filing date will be subject to challenge as having occurred during an active proceeding." He paused. "It's not a wall, but it's a very visible line, and crossing it has consequences he'll have to calculate." She nodded. On the ride back, the valley spread out below them as they came over the rise before the Cross Ranch Road, and she looked at it. The dry, wide, bleached land, the low creek, the pale sky, and thought that she'd spent a month looking at this valley in terms of its numbers and its documents and its legal history, and only now, from this angle, on this road, was she looking at it as a place, as somewhere people had built their lives, as the specific land Emmett Briggs had farmed for 20 years on the faith that water would come to it the way it was supposed to come, and hadn't because someone had rerouted it. "Are you all right?" Gideon said. She realized she'd stopped her horse. "Yes," she said. "I'm just looking." He stopped beside her and looked at the same view. The valley lay below them in the late morning heat, the ranches and farms visible at their distances, the church of the water channel catching the light along the eastern edge where it ran its wrong course. "My father used to say this valley was the best land in the territory," Gideon said. "He said it could feed 10,000 head if the water ran right." He was quiet. I thought he was being sentimental, the way old men get about the land they grew up on. "He wasn't," Lenora said. "No," Gideon said. "He wasn't." They rode down into the valley together, and neither of them said anything else, and the silence was the kind that comes after something important has been spoken, that didn't need more words added to it. The 2 weeks that followed the filing were the most difficult Lenora had spent at Cross Ranch, and that was including the first week when she'd arrived with 70 cents and nowhere to sleep. The difficulty wasn't what she'd expected. She'd expected pressure, more letters, more men like Caulfield, possibly something harder than either. And those things came. There was a second letter, less polite than the first. There was a rumor that spread through town, more organized than the previous ones, saying that the Cross Ranch water rights case was being funded by an Eastern speculating company that wanted to buy up the valley, and that Lenora Hartwell was their agent. She heard this from May, who heard it from the milk delivery woman, who'd heard it in the Drywater Ridge General Store. She didn't try to counter it directly because she'd learned that trying to counter a rumor directly was like trying to put out a fire with your hands. Instead, she kept working, kept being visible, kept doing the ordinary things. Going into town for supplies, speaking to people straightforwardly when they spoke to her, not behaving like someone with something to hide. That was all she could do. She let the behavior answer the story. What she hadn't expected was the waiting. She was not good at waiting. She was good at working, at building, at the forward motion of a problem being solved. The period after filing, when everything was in Aldrich's hands and the court's hands, and there was nothing to do but hold, sat badly on her. She reorganized the ranch accounts again, more thoroughly than before. She helped May put up preserves for the winter. She repaired 3 sections of fence with Thomas, which she had never done before and turned out to be harder than it looked. She read 2 of the accounting texts she'd brought from Waco and hadn't opened since arriving. On the 11th day, Clara Bates came to Cross Ranch. Lenora was in the kitchen when she heard the horse, and she looked out and recognized the woman from her first day in Drywater Ridge, the woman under the overhang who'd told her Webb's was closed with that particular edge of satisfaction, the woman Gideon had silenced with 4 words when Lenora was on her knees in the dirt. She went to the door. Clara Bates dismounted and stood in the yard and looked at Lenora with an expression that was not what Lenora expected. It was not hostile. It was something more effortful than hostile, the expression of someone who had come to do something that cost them. "Mrs. Bates?" Lenora said. "Miss Hartwell." Clara held a covered dish in her hands. She looked at it, and then at Lenora and back at it. "I brought a pie," she said. "Peach, from the last of what I had put up." Lenora looked at the pie. "My family has 40 acres on the North Road," Clara said. "Been paying Blackthorn's water fees for 19 years. She stopped. Started again. "I heard what you found. What you did." Another stop. "My husband said we should have signed your paper. He said it when you were going around, but he said I should be the one to tell you because I was the one who—" She stopped. "Who told me I'd be gone by morning," Lenora said. Not harshly, just completing the sentence. Clara's jaw tightened briefly. "Yes." She held out the pie. "I don't have a gift for apology. Never have. But I can bring a pie." Lenora looked at her for a moment. She thought about everything she'd learned about this valley, about people who'd been afraid so long they'd learned to mock the things they were afraid of hoping for, about how fear made people mean and how that meanness was its own kind of defeat. She took the pie. "Come inside," she said. "May has coffee." Clara Bates followed her into the kitchen, and May looked at the 2 of them and at the pie and said nothing, and poured 3 cups of coffee, and that was that. It was not reconciliation exactly. It was something smaller and more real than reconciliation. Two women sitting at a kitchen table in the middle of a drought, drinking coffee, not saying very much. But it was something. It was the valley starting to shift before the verdict, starting to realign around a different understanding of what was true and what was possible. The morning of the 14th day, Gideon came into the kitchen holding a letter. She looked at his face and knew before he said anything. "Aldrich," he said. "The injunction," she said. "Granted," he said. "Emergency injunction granted. No land transfers in the valley pending the water rights hearing." He set the letter on the table. "The hearing is set for 3 weeks." She sat down. She hadn't planned to sit down. Her legs just made the decision. She sat at the kitchen table where she'd built the case over the weeks that felt much longer than they were, and she looked at the letter and at the word granted, and she felt, for the first time in as long as she could remember, something that was almost peace. Not victory. That wasn't here yet, and she knew better than to call it early. But the feeling of a thing built solidly enough to stand on. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks, Gideon said. May set a coffee cup in front of her without being asked, and outside the window the valley lay in the heat of another dry morning, the water still running its wrong course, the land still waiting. But something had changed. The shape of what was possible had changed, and the people in the valley knew it, and even Victor Blackthorne, in whatever house he sat in counting his different numbers, would have to know it too. Lenora picked up her pen. There was still work to do before the hearing. There would always be more work. But for one moment, she let herself sit still in the kitchen of the ranch where she'd arrived with nothing, and she felt the table under her hands and the coffee warming her palms, and she let herself have the moment. Then she got back to work. The 3 weeks before the hearing were not quiet. Blackthorne's legal team filed 4 separate motions attempting to have the case dismissed before it reached a hearing, challenging the validity of the 1851 survey on the grounds that it was a private document never officially filed, challenging the standing of the Valley families to bring a collective complaint, challenging the chain of custody for Emmett's site survey, and in the 4th motion, challenging Aldrich's licensure on a technicality so thin it was almost insulting. Aldrich responded to each one in writing, methodically, without apparent irritation, the way a man responds to weather he's seen before and knows how to dress for. Lenora read every filing. She sat at the kitchen table with the legal documents Aldrich sent by courier, and she went through them the way she went through ledger entries, looking for gaps, inconsistencies, the places where an argument was reaching further than its evidence could support. She wrote notes in the margins and sent them back to Aldrich, and twice he wrote back to say she'd caught something useful. The second time his letter said, "You have an aptitude for this that has nothing to do with accounting." She folded that letter and put it in the same pocket where she'd put the threatening one weeks earlier, and she thought about the distance between those 2 pieces of paper. Gideon watched her during those 3 weeks with the particular attention of a man who has decided something and is waiting for the right moment to say it. She was aware of it the way you're aware of a change in weather, not alarming, but present, registering somewhere underneath the daily work. She didn't push it. She had enough to manage. The valley itself was changing in small ways. Word of the injunction had traveled fast, and the effect on people was not the explosion of hope she might have imagined, but something quieter and more durable. A settling, a straightening of backs, a quality of waiting that was different from the defeated waiting the drought had imposed. Families who'd been quietly preparing to give up on their land were still there. The Dawes parcel had not been transferred. Old man Dawes, who was 71 and had barely spoken publicly about anything for years, came to Cross Ranch one afternoon and sat in the kitchen with Lenora for 2 hours, going through his own assessment payment records, which he'd kept in a coffee tin under his bed for 19 years, with the instinct of a man who didn't fully trust the world but couldn't bring himself to throw anything away. His records went back further than anyone else's. They were some of the oldest documentation she had. "Why did you keep these?" she asked him. He looked at the tin. "My wife told me to," he said. "She said someday someone would want to know." He paused. "She died 6 years ago. I kept them because she said to." Lenora looked at the records spread between them. She thought about Doris Crane's grandfather and his 1851 survey that had ended up folded in the back of a ledger at Cross Ranch. She thought about all the small acts of record-keeping that ordinary people had performed without knowing what they were preserving, keeping payment records in coffee tins, filing surveys in ledger books, writing things down because something in them said that what was true should be written somewhere, even if no one was asking yet. History was not made only by the people who acted. It was kept by the people who remembered. "Your wife was right," Lenora said. Dawes nodded and looked at his hands. "She usually was," he said. The hearing was held in the Harlan County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in late August, and the room was fuller than Lenora had anticipated. She'd expected the parties, Aldrich and his assistant at one table, Blackthorn's legal team of 3 at another, the judge at the bench. She'd expected Gideon and Emmett and a handful of the signing families in the gallery. What she had not fully anticipated was that word would spread the way it had, or that people would travel the distances they traveled to be in that room. There were people from every corner of the valley. There were families she recognized and families she'd never met. There was Clara Bates, sitting in the 3rd row in her Sunday dress, her husband beside her. There was Thomas, next to his father Emmett, who was dressed in clothes that had been pressed carefully and still showed the creases from the pressing. There was Doris Crane. There was Gruber and his pregnant wife, who looked like she might deliver before the proceedings concluded. There was Old Man Dawes in the back row, sitting very straight. Blackthorn was at the opposing table in a dark suit that had been made for him by someone who understood their business. He was a large man, she saw. She'd never been in the same room with him before, only heard his voice through a closed door that one afternoon. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the particular self-possession of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in any room he entered. He looked at the room with the calm of someone who didn't believe the outcome was seriously in question. He looked at her once, briefly, when she came in with Gideon. His eyes moved across her face with the same dismissive assessment Caulfield had used, the same filing away of someone deemed not worth full attention. She had been filed away by men like that her entire life. It had never stopped her from doing the work. She sat beside Aldrich, and she put her compiled document on the table in front of her, and she folded her hands on top of it, and she waited. The hearing ran for 2 full days. Aldrich presented the case in the order Lenore had built it, beginning with the 1851 survey, establishing the original channel position, then walking through the absence of authorization documentation for any modification, then introducing Emmett's site survey of the physical diversion structures, then laying out the financial accounting of damages. He was methodical and unhurried, and he cited specific documents for every claim, which meant Blackthorn's lawyers spent as much time trying to challenge the documents as trying to challenge the argument. Challenging the documents was difficult because the documents were real. The 1851 survey was challenged on the grounds that a private survey with no official filing had no legal standing. Aldrich responded by producing the surveyor's credentials, Aldrich Crane, certified territorial surveyor, whose qualifications met every standard of the period, and by noting that the absence of an official filing for the original channel position was itself evidence, since the only survey that would have challenged the 1862 authorization had never been entered into the public record, which was convenient for the party that had filed the authorization. The judge, a man named Horace Fenn, who had the focused, slightly tired look of someone who'd been doing this work for a long time and still took it seriously, asked Blackthorn's lead attorney directly, "Is there any documentation showing the channel in its current position prior to the 1862 authorization filing?" There was a pause. "The 1862 filing itself reflects the channel as it existed at the time of filing," the attorney said. "That's not what I asked," Judge Fenn said. Another pause. "No, Your Honor. There is no prior documentation of the channel in its current position." The room was quiet enough that Lenora heard someone behind her exhale slowly. Emmett testified about the physical structures. He was not a natural speaker in formal settings. He was a farmer and a surveyor, not a lawyer, and there were moments where his answers were blunter than might have been strategically ideal. But when Blackthorn's attorney pressed him on the precision of his measurements, Emmett looked at him and said, "I've been doing survey work since before you were practicing law. If you want to challenge my measurements, bring someone who can show me where they're wrong." No one brought anyone. Lenora was called to testify on the financial accounting. She had been prepared for this by Aldrich over 2 evenings in Crestfall, and the preparation had been thorough, and she was still nervous in a way she hadn't expected. Not about the material, which she knew completely, but about the weight of the room, The weight of the people behind her who had traveled here, who had kept records in coffee tins, who had farmed land for 20 years that was always a little wrong because the water was wrong. She sat in the witness chair and she answered every question directly, and she did not embellish and she did not hedge. When Blackthorn's attorney tried to characterize her accounting as speculative, she asked him to identify a specific calculation he believed was inaccurate. He gestured broadly at the methodology. She asked again for a specific calculation. He moved on. At one point, the attorney said, "Miss Hartwell, isn't it true that you arrived in this valley as a stranger, with no connection to this land and no established standing in this community, and that you have personally benefited from your association with Cross Ranch throughout this process?" She looked at him. "I arrived in this valley as a stranger, yes. I was employed at Cross Ranch because I was qualified to do the work. The work I did is in those documents." She paused. "Whether I am a stranger or a longtime resident doesn't change what the numbers show." "It might speak to your motivations," he said. "My motivations are in the documents too," she said. "Everything I found, I documented. Everything I documented is verifiable. If my motivation were to deceive this court, I would have done a poor job of making everything so easy to check." Judge Fenn made a note. Passant. Blackthorn himself testified on the second afternoon. He was composed and fluent and presented the Blackthorn family's history in the valley as one of investment, stewardship, and responsible management of a shared resource. He talked about the costs of maintaining the water infrastructure, about the assessments being fair compensation for that maintenance, about the 1862 authorization as a legitimate formalization of an existing arrangement. When Aldrich cross-examined him, he asked one question that Lenore had written and given to Aldrich on a folded piece of paper the previous evening. "Mr. Blackthorn," Aldrich said, "if the channel modification was a legitimate and authorized improvement to the valley's water infrastructure, why is there no record of any public notice, hearing, or consultation with the other landowners in the valley prior to the modification?" Blackthorn looked at Aldrich. "The modification occurred before the county authority was established," he said. "There was no formal requirement for public consultation." "There was no legal requirement," Aldrich said. "But you're describing an action that redirected water away from dozens of farming and ranching families who depended on that water. Were any of them consulted?" A pause. "My grandfather made decisions based on the information available to him at the time. And the families who lost direct water access, were they compensated? The assessment structure provides ongoing access. At a price," Aldrich said, "for water that previously ran to them freely." He let that sit for a moment. No further questions. The room was very quiet when Aldrich sat down. Blackthorn stepped down from the witness stand with the same controlled composure he'd maintained throughout, but something in his carriage had changed. A very slight rigidity, the posture of a man holding himself together by will rather than ease. Judge Fenn took one day to deliberate. Lenora spent that day at Cross Ranch doing the things she always did when she needed to keep her hands occupied. She worked through the ranch accounts. She helped May in the kitchen. She walked the fence line with Harrison in the afternoon because he was checking for storm damage from a brief, useless rain that had come through the previous night. The rain had done nothing for the drought, but it had made the air smell different, briefly, like something green and living that the land was trying to remember. "You think Fenn rules our way?" Harrison said while they walked. "I think the evidence is clear," she said. "Whether clear evidence is sufficient depends on the judge." Harrison walked for a while. "I've been on this ranch 11 years, he said. "I've seen a lot of things come and go. Droughts, cattle losses, Gideon's father getting old and Gideon taking over. Good years and bad ones." He paused. "I've never seen anything like what you did in 2 months." She looked at him. "I just did the accounting." "No," Harrison said. "You did the accounting and you got on a horse in the middle of the night and you sat at kitchen tables with people who were scared and you made them feel like the truth was worth something." He looked at the fence line. "That's not just accounting." She didn't have a response to that. She walked beside him and let it be. Oh. The ruling came by courier the following morning. Judge Fenn found that the 1851 survey, in combination with Emmett's physical site documentation and the absence of any authorization record for a channel modification prior to the 1862 filing, established sufficient grounds to invalidate the Blackthorn Land and Water Company's claim to exclusive assessment authority over the valley's primary water channel. He found that the channel modification having been undertaken without public notice, compensation, or legal authorization under any applicable territorial statute, constituted an unlawful appropriation of a shared water resource. He ordered the Water Authority dissolved and directed the county to establish a new Public Water Access Commission with representation from all affected landholders. He ordered an independent assessment of damages owed to Valley families based on Lenora's financial accounting to be conducted within 90 days. He did not order the channel physically moved. That was the one piece that wasn't in the ruling, and Aldrich had warned her it might not be. The physical infrastructure was complex, and the legal mechanism for compelling its modification was a separate proceeding. But with the assessment authority dissolved and a public commission in place, the channel's future management was no longer Blackthorn's to dictate. It was enough. It was in the ways that mattered most, everything. She was in the kitchen when Gideon read the ruling aloud. May was at the range and stopped stirring whatever she was stirring and stood with her back still turned, very still. Thomas, who had taken to coming to the ranch most mornings on some pretext or another, sat at the table and looked at his hands when Gideon finished reading. Nobody said anything immediately. That was how it was, she thought, when something you'd been fighting for a long time actually arrived. There was no explosion of feeling, there was just a shift, a sudden absence of the pressure that had been present so long you'd stop distinguishing it from the ordinary weight of the day. Then May made a sound from the range, not a word, just a sound, low and private, the sound of something released. Thomas looked up and his eyes were bright in a way that he was clearly hoping nobody would mention, so nobody did. "Tell your father," Lenora said to him. He was out the door before she finished the sentence. Oh. The damage assessments took longer than 90 days. They took nearly 6 months, because the scope of the financial harm across the valley was larger than even Lenora's calculations had fully captured, and the independent assessors had to work through records from dozens of families going back decades. Some families had records like Dawes's, carefully kept in tins. Others had nothing, and for those the assessors worked from general valley data and the established rate history, which meant the numbers were estimates rather than precise figures. Some families received more than they'd expected. Some received less. Nobody received everything they were owed in the full moral sense of the word, because that was not how these things worked. 30 years of wrong could not be precisely quantified and returned. But the assessment authority was dissolved, and the fees stopped, and the new public commission set access rates that were a fraction of what Blackthorn had been charging, and the Dawes parcel stayed in Dawes's hands, and Gruber's farm stayed in Gruber's hands, and the valley held. Blackthorn challenged the ruling twice through the territorial appeals process. Both challenges failed. By the time the second one was dismissed, he had sold the majority of his valley holdings and moved his business interests to the Eastern Territories. He did not leave dramatically. He left quietly, in the way that men who have built their power on things that couldn't survive scrutiny tend to leave, efficiently, without acknowledgement, as if the place had simply stopped being useful. The valley did not celebrate his departure. There was too much work to do rebuilding what had been lost in the drought years, but there was a quality in the air after, a kind of opening, as if a pressure that had been so constant, people had stopped feeling it as pressure had finally simply lifted. The rains came in October. Not torrential, not the dramatic ending that stories sometimes supplied, but steady and real. 3 weeks of proper autumn rain that filled the creek and the tanks and softened the baked ground and brought the first real color back to the pastures. Lenora stood on the porch of the ranch house in the rain one evening and watched the water run in the yard and thought about the channel and the map and the coffee tin and the folded letter in her pocket and the distance she'd traveled to get to this porch in this rain. She'd come to this valley with 70 cents and no one expecting her anywhere on the continent. She'd fallen to her knees in a dusty street, and a man had offered her his hand not out of sentimentality, but because it was the practical thing to do. She'd made herself useful the only way she knew how, by looking at what was true and saying it out loud and writing it down so carefully that no one could pretend it wasn't there. It was not a heroic story, she thought, not the way people meant when they said heroic. There had been no single moment of courage, no confrontation in the street, no dramatic reversal. It had been a month of lamplit evenings and careful numbers and letters and a long ride to Crestfall in the dark. It had been learning a ranch and a valley and a set of people who were all imperfect and scared and capable of being better than they had been, given the right conditions. She'd spent her whole life being told in small and large ways that she was insufficient, too plain, too transient, too alone, too much of the wrong things and not enough of the right ones. She'd learned, somewhere along the way, to answer that judgment not with argument, but with work. Just work. Just the daily accumulation of useful things done well, until the weight of it said something that could not be unsaid. The rain ran off the porch roof in a thin curtain, and the yard smelled of wet earth, and the cattle in the near paddock had lifted their heads and were standing in it, still accepting it. She heard Gideon come out onto the porch behind her. She didn't turn. She heard him stop a foot or two away, and then she heard the sound of something set down on the porch railing, small, metallic. She looked. It was a key. Iron, old, worn smooth from years of use. The house key. The actual key to the ranch house, which she'd watched him take from his pocket and use every day for 2 months without thinking about it particularly. "What is this?" she said. He stood beside her. He was looking at the rain, not at her. "You know what it is?" "I know what it is literally," she said. "I want to know what you mean by it." He was quiet for a moment. In the rain, his face was very still. Not closed, but the way a face is when the person wearing it has given up being careful. "I've been running this ranch alone for 8 years," he said, "since my father died. Running it and managing it and making every decision about it by myself, and mostly I was fine with that because I'm not someone who needs a great deal of company." He paused. "And then you sat down at my kitchen table and told me my water entries didn't have enough detail, and 2 months later the water authority that's been bleeding this valley for 30 years is dissolved." He looked at her. "I'm not good at speeches. I'm not going to pretend I am." "I know you're not," she said. "What I'm good at is knowing when something is working," he said, "and knowing when it would be a serious mistake to let it stop." She looked at the key on the railing. She thought about all the places she'd been before this one. All the kitchen tables and ledger books and fresh start towns that had turned out not to be fresh starts. She thought about what it had meant, all her life, to never quite belong anywhere. To always be the one who could be sent away. To hold her life in a travel bag and keep her boots in good shape because that was the thing that mattered when you never knew how long you'd be staying. She picked up the key. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe that was just the weight she put on it. She held it in her palm for a moment and felt the worn smoothness of it, the shape that had been made by years of the same hand touching it in the same way, the particular weight of a thing that belonged to a specific place and had nowhere else to be. "I'm not easy to live with," she said. "I stay up too late. I reorganize things without asking. I will tell you when you're wrong." "I know all of that," he said, "and I'll probably find something else in this valley that needs fixing before long." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "I'm counting on it," he said. She closed her hand around the key. She never packed the travel bag again. Or rather, she repacked it once, 6 months later, when she rode to Crestfall to meet with Aldrich about the secondary damages proceeding, and she took it only because it was the right size for the documents she needed to carry. She brought it back to the ranch and hung it on the hook inside the storage room door, the small room where she'd spent her first nights, now returned to its proper use as a storage room, and she left it there. The valley changed slowly, the way valleys do. The new Water Commission established fair rates and maintained the infrastructure with labor and money shared across all the landholders, which meant the work was harder than it had been under Blackthorn's system, but the cost was distributed honestly. Some ranches that had been near failure pulled back from the edge. Some families who'd held on by their fingernails found that with fair water access, the land produced what it was always capable of producing. Emmett Briggs's east pasture irrigated properly for the first time in his memory. He wrote Lenora a letter about it, 1 page in the precise hand of a surveyor. He described the water reaching the east corner where it had never reached before, soaking into the cracked ground and disappearing, and coming back up 3 days later in the roots of the grass that had seemed dead. He said he'd stood there and watched it, and he hadn't known what to do with the feeling, so he'd gone inside and told his wife, and she'd cried, which he hadn't expected, and then he'd cried a little too, which he was mentioning only because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be recorded somewhere. She read the letter at the kitchen table, and May was there, and didn't ask what it said, and Lenora folded it carefully and put it in the box she'd started keeping under the window seat, the box where she put things that should be kept. Not in a pocket this time, somewhere permanent. Thomas Briggs stayed on at Cross Ranch eventually. He didn't make a formal arrangement about it. He just kept coming and kept being useful, and one day Gideon paid him a proper wage, and that was that. He grew into the work the way young men grow into things they were meant for, with a lack of self-consciousness that was better to watch than any deliberate effort would have been. Lenora taught him the accounts, because she'd learned from May that the best thing you could do with something useful was pass it to the next person. May herself never said much about the whole business, before or after. She cooked and she managed the kitchen, and she watched everything with that attention that looked like indifference, and occasionally she set a cup of coffee next to someone who needed it, without being asked, and she said things at rare intervals that landed with the weight of things that had been thought through carefully before they were said. One morning, about a year after the ruling, she said to Lenora while they were working side by side at the kitchen table, "You know what I think you did?" Lenora looked up. "What?" "You came here with nothing," May said, "so you had nothing to lose. And because you had nothing to lose, you looked at the thing everyone else was too scared to look at." She paused. "And then you looked at it carefully enough that it couldn't be looked away from." Lenora thought about that. "I just did what I knew how to do," she said. "That's what I mean," May said. There was a truth in that which Lenora turned over for a long time afterward. Not because it was flattering, it wasn't entirely, but because it was accurate, and accuracy mattered more to her than flattery ever had. She had come to this valley with nothing, and that nothingness had been, in its strange way, a kind of freedom. She hadn't been protecting anything when she'd opened the old ledger. She hadn't been risking a social position or a business relationship or a family standing when she'd ridden to the county records office and asked the questions no one wanted asked. She'd been risking exactly what she always risked: herself, her work, her willingness to stay. And those things, it turned out, were enough. The world is full of wrongs that persist not because they're hidden, but because the cost of seeing them clearly is too high for anyone with something to lose. What changes things is not always power or wealth or the right connections. Sometimes it's a woman with 70 cents and good boots and the habit of writing things down, who arrives at exactly the moment when the wrong has gone on long enough that the ground is ready. She didn't save the valley alone. She was careful to know that. Emmett Briggs had done the survey. Aldrich had filed the case. Gideon had stood in the yard and let his face be visible to everyone. The families who'd signed their names had signed, knowing what it could cost them. Old man Dawes had kept his records in a tin for 19 years because his wife told him to. All of it together had been what was needed. Not one extraordinary person, but a collection of ordinary ones who had finally, at the right moment, been given something clear enough to stand behind. That was the thing she'd built. Not just a legal case, a place to stand. She stood there for the rest of her life.